Good morning. Hello, everyone. As people are slowly dropping in or signing up, joining us here on Zoom in our Nordregio studio. I will keep on talking a little bit so we have more people joining because it's a Friday morning and it's early for some of you, depending on our different time zones across Europe. Anyway, very welcome to this webinar and policy workshop hosted by Nordregio and the FUME project under Horizon 2020 program. So my name is Åsa Ström Hildestrand and I work here at Nordregio and I will be your moderator today as we run through the program. And with me, I also have my colleague Vaida, who will moderate our Zoom chat. Vaida,
hello, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, and welcome to pose your questions in the Zoom chat. We will take it in the second part.
Exactly. We'll have time for discussion in the second part of the program. I'll go through the program in brief very soon. But anyway, also, if you have links to related reports, project websites, etc., please post them, share them in the chat function. So today's topic, today we'll hear more about new research and studies on drivers on migration to Europe. So why do people migrate to Europe? And what can we learn from analyzing these drivers that we could use to predict future migration patterns to Europe in the form of narratives of development and scenarios. This is what we'll hear about today. And of course, it's a very timely topic. Post-COVID, migration patterns have changed a little bit, or where migration was disrupted during COVID, as I'm sure you're all well aware, but now in a time of war and rising inflation, etc., rising inflation rates, it's again lots of things driving migration from many different parts of the world. So we will also discuss implications for policymakers and together draft some policy recommendations that will be summarized in a policy brief afterwards. So that's the aims of today. So really two aims, and the program also has two parts. So with a 5-minute break in between, and we are planning to run the program until about 11:45. So part one, we have invited 4 of our FUME researchers to share their latest learnings on what is driving migration and how these drivers impact future narratives and predictions on migration to Europe. And then in part 2, we have some of our Nordregio colleagues, researchers, who will present the draft policy recommendations and discuss these with a panel of experts and with you, again, via the Zoom chat. So please put your questions there as we walk along the program, and we'll pick them up a little bit later. Another important point of logistics this time is that we are recording the webinar, and we'll share the recording afterwards together with all the presentations and other links that are of interest. So you can expect an email beginning of next week with this recording and presentations. And that's of course also for all of you who signed up to this webinar. We're happy to see that there's a big interest in this topic, but who can't join us at this particular time. So recording will be available. I think that was all I was gonna say at the beginning, because now I wanted to hand over to Carsten Kessler. You are the FUME project manager, project leader, and you're from the Bochum University in Germany. So Carsten, you've been running this project now a couple of years. We're actually starting the final year of FUME. this year. So very welcome to the program, and please tell us a little bit more about the aims and expected results and impacts that you're hoping to achieve with this project. Carsten, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Åsa. Also to the whole team at Norregio, thank you very much for organizing this workshop. And I don't have a fancy studio here as you do, so welcome to my home office.
Can't all be as lucky.
Yeah, so I'm just a few words on behalf of the project coordinators, Henning Sten Hansen and myself. We're actually coordinating this still from Aalborg University in Denmark, which is where I was when the project started, and I've moved back to Germany in the meantime. So for those of you who are not familiar with the project yet, it's called Future Migration Scenarios for Europe, as Åsa said. FUME or FUME, we still haven't settled on a common pronunciation, but that's our shortcut. And it's been funded under the call Understanding Migration Mobility Patterns, Elaborating Mid- and Long-Term Migration Scenarios. So we've been running since the end of 2019, so basically right before COVID hit everyone. And of course, the project has also been affected by the pandemic to a certain extent. And this was also the reason why we have extended the project by half a year. So now we are, as Åsa said, entering the final phase, and the project is now scheduled to finish at the end of May. And in April, we're going to have a final conference. We're currently organizing that in Brussels. There will be more concrete information about that soon. So stay tuned if you want to attend this. This conference will be organized together with our two sister projects, QuantMig and especially Hummingbird. So these three projects have all been funded under the same call, started more or less at the same time, and they all look at this topic of migration mobility patterns, especially in the mid and long-term perspective, from different angles. So QuantMig looks at modeling issues and uncertainty in modeling and things like that. Hummingbird looks at things like new data sources, excuse me, using social media, mobile phone data, things like that. And the special thing about FUME is that we're looking at migration at different levels of scale. So usually when you analyze or also project migration patterns, you always stop at the national level. So you have models that spit out by national migration flows, so flows between countries. But of course, the people that migrate, they are not floating around in these countries in the end where they migrate. They settle somewhere, and usually that's in a larger city. So what we're doing is we're taking these national projections and scale them down first to a regional level, and then at the end to a high-level grid in the cities. And because this is relatively complex task, we only do this for 4 case study cities. That's Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Rome, and Krakow. And well, this work is currently being finished. Now that's the destination side. On the origin side, we also have 4 case studies. That's Senegal, Iraq, Ukraine, and Tunisia as representatives of different kinds of origin countries where migrants to Europe typically come from. The objective there was to better understand why people want to migrate to Europe. So there was a lot of interview work being done. And the idea there was similar to the destination case studies, namely that it's usually the local conditions that make someone want to migrate. Especially if you have large countries, then of course it can be a huge difference between people in the countryside and people living in cities, for example. So through these interviews, we also try to get a better understanding of what these local conditions are that make people want to migrate, and also whether they actually have the capacity to do so. I guess most people here are familiar with this so-called migration hump. And then, of course, it can make a big difference whether you're in the poor and in the countryside, or a little bit richer and in the city and actually have the money to potentially migrate to Europe. So in terms of the results, we have quite a... Also?
No, sorry, I just said we'll hear more soon about these very interesting studies from the sending country.
Yes.
Yes, but then when it comes to the results, exactly, sorry to interrupt you, what are you expecting or hoping to achieve with FUME overall?
Well, I mean, from these origin countries, we have a really rich body of interview data now and reports that summarize them, and we will hear about some of that from Jan in the next presentation. We have our scenarios that Dilek will talk about, and we already have the national level projections that YASA and PIK, Potsdam Institute, produced. And as I said, we're currently finalizing the downscaling to the regional and city level. It's currently being finalized. And in combination, we just hope that these results provide some information to EU policymakers regarding different possible futures within Europe, but also globally, depending on how different regions in the globe develop. Of course, the whole project started before nobody was talking about the situation that we have in Europe today. So it's actually something that we also had to react to a little bit in the project with our scenarios, that conflicts like that can happen.
Yeah, scenarios is always, of course, a very difficult business. By nature. But thank you so much, Karsten. I think I'll interrupt you there and
I'm done anyway.
Exactly. And I will also you'll have a chance to come back and wrap up and give a few comments as well towards the end of the program. Anyways, very welcome again and good to see you all. I see all our other speakers lined up here. So let's get started with our first researcher, Karolina Sobczak-Żelch from the Krakow University of Economics. Very welcome, Karolina, and please tell us more about this study that Karsten mentioned about the different sending countries that you have looked at more in detail. Very welcome.
Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Much and good morning for everyone. As was said, my name is Karolina Sobczak-Żelch. I'm from Krakow University of Economics, and I have a pleasure today to present the results of research that were carried by a group of researchers from Italy, Denmark, also Poland, and mostly I'm going to focus on lessons learned from 4 qualitative case studies. We have focused on 4 cities or regions, because in Iraq, as you can see, we have chosen 2 cities. It's Dahoub and Zakou. In Senegal, it was Dakar. In Tunisia, Sousse, and finally Kyiv in Ukraine. Why actually those 4 case studies? There was already a question about Turkey. And first of all, what need to be underlined, we were focused on origin countries, not on transit. That's why Turkey was not under investigation. And we are looking at the role of cities. And we have chosen those 4 case studies because there were some aspects that made them similar, and all of them were important destination of multiple trajectories of internal mobility, so seasonal, commuting, intra-regional, but also all of them were significant starting points and stepping stones for internal migration. And there were some differences which gave us diversity in obtained results. First of all, factors that we were looking at them were, we were looking for variability and complexity of those factors that influence international migration to EU. And here we were looking at socioeconomic factors, political, also environmental, as well as demographic And also those 4 cities represent, or countries present 4 main origin areas. That's Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, Middle East, and Eastern Europe. We tried to answer for three key questions. Firstly, what are the silent characteristics and patterns of the process of migration decision-making and the interlinked trajectories of internal and international migration? To what extent investigated cities represent a stepping stone for migration abroad for many internal migrants from rural villages and small towns who arrived in the cities at different times? And finally, what are the possible future migration scenarios from investigated case studies to Europe? Whether our assumptions on the time of arrival of migrants as a differentiating factor were true, mostly yes, only Ukraine was an exception here. And for instance, in Tunisia, if we differentiate the migrants into settled and newcomers, settled migrants usually came to the city looking for better life perspectives, and international migration was not actually their future aspiration. International migration became a perspective and the wish for their children. It's, as we can see in this quotation, what would encourage you to send your children abroad, thinking about their future. I live here for 45 years. Do you think I can live for 40 or 20 years more? Nobody knows about his fate. I want them to have a better life. I no longer care about anything else. And newcomers, these are usually youth. They are looking for better perspective. They're ready to go abroad with a first possibility. They have fewer anchors in the current place of residence. And here the recent trends also include internationalization of higher education. So they use Erasmus programs and so on, and overstay the time of education. And also finally, this is generation that is interested in technology and globalization, so they have bigger access to new information. And this is what one of our experts underlined, that this group, these are people who move from one region to another. It's mainly to look for another opportunity. If they do not find their chances in one of three big cities of Tunisia, that's Tunis, Sfax, or Sousse, they will look elsewhere. And similar situation we can see also in Senegal. Dakar emerged as an ambivalent urban experience, mostly for those settled migrants. And initially, Dakar was not conceived as an intermediate step to move forward. Migration was considered only to a limited extent, because already moving to the capital was a radical cultural change. And migration abroad is seen as an alternative to overcome social stuckness and insecurity of everyday life. However, among newcomers, city is mostly perceived as a short stopover to reach Europe because of the difficulty to succeed quickly. And despite the increased propensity to migrate abroad, the city often became a final destination, rather by default than by choice. Here we face this mismatch between aspirations, capabilities, and migration, mostly because the individual propension to stay or to migrate abroad is a mix of casualties, often unplanned chances, fortuitous circumstances. Also in Tunisia, we have faced this statement that sea is available for everyone, as when you don't have this legal opportunity. And then legal migration is increasingly perceived as an unattainable dream rather than a feasible and planned project. And propension to migrate abroad coexist with an optional openness to move back and work on the family land in rural area of origin. And as I said, Ukraine didn't fit precisely to our results. Plans and strategies for further international migration did not depend on the time of coming to the city, and it's important that the research were conducted before the February 2022. So it's not current situation, but the one before the war. And among all investigated categories, there were people willing to stay and those who were thinking about migration. And also what's important, if there were any nationalistic sentiments among the migrants, there was also conviction that working for one's own country is a mission and a kind of moral duty. And finally, a couple of key takeaways. So first of all, urban experience plays a key role to understand individual and collective propension to mobility. It becomes a field of assessment of the individual aspirations to move, to stay put. Then cities could become a stepping stone for further migration, not only abroad, but also internally, but often turns to be a final destination. By default, rather, here we can face this mentioned mismatch between aspiration, capabilities, and migration. The research over groups of internal migrants regarding different time of their arrival suggests that individual migration trajectories are fragmented. There are different step backs, restarts, and so on. Also, the decision to move abroad, to stay or return are subject to changes along the route and time. There are different intervened casualties and fortuities. And finally, the research on specific local case studies in countries of origin highlight the influence of different historical background on migration trajectories. And I will stop here, giving back voice to Norwegia.
Right. Thank you so much, Carolina. I think this is super interesting. I think many of us also feel that yeah, we should probably do more of studies of this kind to really understand the thinking and the drivers, and that it's not as easy as I think many at least debaters of migration in Europe would think. Just on a more sort of, well, when you went through all this material, what were the main surprises to you? I mean, you obviously studied this a long time. Were you surprised by any of the results? And did you see any big differences between the different cities or people in different cities that you looked at? Anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, we were happy to gather among our team members people who really spend a lot of time before in our areas of origin. So we had researchers who were doing research in Senegal. I was doing quite a long time research in Tunisia, also in Ukraine, a little bit less in Iraq. So actually those research confirmed our assumptions that we took at the beginning. But I think that this difference between generations was the first thing, that there is still very strong role of, particularly like in Tunisia and Senegal, of that they're really rooted in origin. So those who are not living in Europe yet, they are still rooted in their origins and they're still thinking about going back there. And this relation with family and so on, but they are somehow pushed by the circumstances that they face in the city and their loss of possibility to develop the aspirations, to fulfill their aspirations there in the cities. This is something what really pushed them to move, to look for other opportunities. I think that was like the strength of this, or this mismatch between what they really want and how they are pushed to move. This is something what somehow also surprised us, or maybe was.
And that is also a little contradictory, because some of your respondents, they do talk about this culture of migration and that it's been a part of the of life planning or whatever for a long time, specifically in Senegal, I think you mentioned in the report. So I don't know if you could say something. Do you see that is changing with the new young generation, that there is a weaker culture of migration, or any comments on that?
I would say that we can observe this vicious cycle, but there is always the question about where actually they end their migration. So they are thinking, because they are connected with a global network. So already for those who are in origins, they already know what their friends who left before, what they faced in Dakar, what they faced in Sousse or Tunis or Dahouk, and that they failed to fulfill their aspirations there. So particularly for those in Senegal, they do not expect, like, even if at the beginning they were thinking about staying in Dakar, they realized quite soon that it's not possible. And if they want to fulfill their needs, they need to move abroad. But they wish to go to Europe. It's not always feasible to be done. It's a wish, but very often I think that it's also important to say that Europe is a wish to go, but most of migration actually is to neighboring countries as well.
Right. But and then still many also wish that they would not have to move or have to migrate.
That's the different and capabilities. So one thing is to have aspirations to go to Europe. Everyone would like to go to Europe because it's perceived as a better world. But another thing is to have those real capabilities to go and to fulfill their needs, because what is missing actually from European side of policymakers, of those who try to influence the countries of origin, is the information that it's not so easy if you get there illegally.
Exactly, yeah. And we have seen lots of evidence of that as well, but that hasn't been part of your particular study. But thank you so much, Carolina, and you'll also be able to come in a bit later and comment on some of the policy recommendations that we're drafting here. Thank you. And now over to Jan Broszowski, one of your colleagues at the Krakow University of Economics, and you have actually done a study more specifically on migrants closer to Europe, namely in Poland. And I think it's very interesting that you did a survey on Ukrainian migrants in Poland, but just before the war started. So that's, of course, impacted your results. So we should keep that in mind when you show your results. And then I'm sure you have some thoughts also on how this situation or results would change if you would do the survey now, considering the current situation. But Jan, very welcome.
Hello. Thanks for kind introduction. Yes, indeed. In our project we have. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
In our project we have focused. We have selected Poland for the case study on new emerging destinations in Europe, for very simple reason, because Poland is the largest in terms of the population size of the new member states who joined the EU from 2004 onwards. Plus, Poland has experienced in last 5-7 years the most, I would say, spectacular migration transition from all the Eastern European countries who are members of the EU. Basically, before 2015, the population of foreigners in Poland was below half of the percentage point of the population. Now, of course, together with refugees, the population of foreigners is around 2.5 million, which accounts for more than 5% of the population. So within FUME project, we have carried out a survey. Our goal was to carry out the first survey which would be representative, which is not easy for Poland. Of course, I don't have time now to discuss about all the details, but the other limitations coming from the registers and access to these registers. That's why we have decided to focus on the one of the most important regions for Poland, Małopolska region, which is which capital Kraków is the second largest Polish city, and this is the second region in terms of receiving migrants in Poland, just after Mazowieckie and Warszawa. Mazowieckie, so the central region with the capital Warszawa, Warsaw, and We have relied on public register, which in principle should include all legal migrants with resident permits. Later on, maybe in Q&A, I might have an opportunity to explain the limitations. So why we have focused on region and not on the full country, but we managed to achieve a result which is, I would say, more than satisfactory for research purposes at the regional level. So we claim that our results are fully representative for Małopolska region. And that is important for migrants coming from third countries. Yes, so from the outside of the EU, and these migrants compose the vast majority of migrants who come to Poland. Why actually we conducted this study? Because Poland, together, of course, with other Eastern European countries, is a very recent destination for migrants from outside of the EU. And when we started the project, there was a huge public debate about how permanent this migration can be actually, especially taking into the account that German government at the time was planning to issue a more liberal policy towards third country nationals who are already are there in the EU, and especially who reside in Eastern European countries of the EU. So the challenge was that maybe these migrants who have arrived to Poland are basically transiting into more Western destinations, including Germany. And we wanted to test it because it was also crucial from our perspective when it comes to developing the FUME model and the predictions for predictions of migration scenarios for Europe. And also, of course, for making dedicated demographic forecast for Poland. So that was our main research questions. So are the new immigrants interested in settling permanently in Poland? So just to get the basic glance on the problem of the situation. So as you can see on the chart, on the left, before 2000, there were, most of migrants did not arrive in the 1990s. So it's a marginal issue. But then when it comes to all migrants who came until 2014, actually, all of them composed less than 1/4 of the sample. Yeah, so the vast majority came with 2015 and onwards, which is obviously related very much to the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, Euromaidan incidents, and the Russian aggression on Donbas region and the annexation of Crimea region. So these motivations of arrival are both economic, but partially also political ones. So this has to be kept in mind, that although we are talking about economic migrants in vast majority, some of them are quasi-refugees which have been internally displaced within Ukraine. And very important when we will continue discussion about post-war situation. So the survey was conducted in December 2021 and January 2022, just before the war started. But of course, I will give a very short follow-up, and I will try to explain how it relates to current situation. Please look that more than 1/2 of migrants were married. This is important, and this incidence is highest among Ukrainians. Yes, so Ukrainians composed some 63–64%, so 2/3 of the migrants. They were the most numerous migrants in our sample, and these are on average very young people, young and very young people. So as you can see, 1/3 is below 35 years of age. Plus, this group was at the time male dominated. Males composed around 60% of migrants. And the most important chart now, so you can see on this chart, we have separated Ukrainian migrants with red bar and the totality of migrants. And we asked them about, so there was a huge, I mean, a very broad battery of questions about their not only economic, but socio-economic integration. And of course, their remigration plans, including also migration preparedness. This goes in line with this finding of Carolina and her team about the aspirations and capabilities to migrate. We know very well that migration declarations are very, very cheap in a way, yeah. But when it comes to really moving, this requires some preparation and some investments and resources, which not necessarily migrants who already moved and who already incurred several costs that these migrants really have. So as you can see, the percentage of Ukrainians who declared that they want to remain in Poland permanently is extremely high for very recent migrants. Please take into the consideration that in vast majority, those people arrived from 2015 onwards. So their length of residence in Poland is very, very short. It's usually less than 5-6 years, yes? And 80%, it's a lot, but when you see their economic integration, most of migrants, and especially Ukrainians, work full-time. So this is visible here. So they came mostly here for economic reasons, and they are quite well integrated on the labor market. I didn't have time to, because of course the questionnaire was very long, but I can assure you that they also, that was very actually optimistic finding, a surprising finding, anticipating maybe one of your questions, that they felt very well integrated when it comes to economic activity. So it not only comes to finding a full-time job, but also in assessing the qualification usage on the labor market. So they claimed that in majority, their qualifications were used properly on a labor market in the occupations they were performing. Moreover, their satisfaction from performing a specific job was very high. And of course, the other dimensions, more soft, so this is about the identity. As you can see, around 80% of the respondents also feel that Poland is becoming their new home. This is also very important, and the reason probably why they have not moved further to the West. In the case of Ukrainians, the cultural proximity, also when it comes to usage of their language, is very close to Polish one. So for Ukrainians to learn Polish is relatively easy. That's why most of migrants indicated relatively high. Of course, this is self-assessment. Yes, this might be a bias that this is slightly over-optimistic, but still they assess the proficiency in Polish quite well. But of course, when it comes to other languages, they even admitted that their commandment on not only German, which is probably expected, but also when it comes to English, is rather low. So for them, already Poland is a West, and then moving more to the West means problems on the labor market, as they do not speak any other foreign language.
Great.
Yeah, this is pretty much it.
Pretty much it.
Yes,
Yes.
because I want to give some time for discussion and maybe questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan. I think this is very interesting results in many ways. I think that you highlight the language issue there, and we've actually done some studies recently in the Nordic countries where we come to this exact conclusion that the knowledge of English is not very high among Ukrainians, and that for that reason many are frustrated that they find it hard to find work in the Nordic countries. So I think it definitely resonates with this result. Anyways, I think just one, because time is running here, but maybe just one reflection you could make then on, I mean, obviously this is difficult to say, but what would you expect from when you've seen, or the studies that might have been done on the current Ukrainian refugees to Poland? Do you feel a similar sentiment in terms of staying longer, or is there a more general sense that more of the refugees are actually there more short term in Poland? Any comments on that?
Well, this is very interesting, because we are now after almost 1 year, and we can compare. We have finally some more reliable data. We have, of course, in the initial phase of the refugee problem, let's say, or refugee development situation. Yes, we have conducted an initial research on refugee population in Poland, and at the time, obviously, the responses were, I don't know, I'm not really sure whether I will stay in Poland longer or shorter, because of course at that time the uncertainty among Ukrainian refugees when it comes to development of the war was very high. By now we can say first the first, let's say, expectations that many actually males who are Ukrainians and who were residing in Poland were in mass returned to Ukraine did not materialize. Okay. So we were expecting that up to 300,000 Ukrainians could return to Ukraine to fight for the country and to enroll in the army. This did not happen. Actually, the flow was much lower, 60 to 80,000 people. Plus, as you can see, most of our migrants were already married at the time of the survey, just before the war. So actually the opposite happened. Their partners, female partners, have joined them with their kids. So it means that the center of life, which already was turning into becoming Poland as a home country, as the center of their life, has now moved definitely to because the family reunification occurred. So I would say this, of course, there are some single women who migrated without their husbands or partners from Ukraine with children, and their partners remain in Ukraine. Those obviously are in high uncertainty, and probably many of them would like to return. But a vast number actually of Ukrainian refugees joined their families in Poland.
And hopefully they're then supporting Ukraine in other ways then through their work and
very helpful.
Money,
this is the big difference, I would say, from other locations in Europe.
Okay. Super interesting. Thank you. I'm sorry that we're a bit short of time, but thanks again, Jan, and you'll be back in the discussion later as well. And now let's turn over to Arkadiusz Wisniewski at the University of Manchester. Welcome to the program. And you will focus a little bit, or take a step sort of up again towards the national and EU level, where you have done a study among EU policy and migration experts and asked them about drivers behind migration, etc. So it's a different kind of study that you'll now explain a bit further, and what they foresee in terms of migration patterns to Europe. So very welcome.
Thank you very much, Asa. Good morning, everyone. So yes, my name is Arkadiusz Wiśniewski from the University of Manchester, and I will show our findings from the Delphi study. Before I show you the findings, let me just very briefly explain what a Delphi is. It's a technique of eliciting opinions from experts in various fields, especially in situations where information is not available or it is difficult to learn from the available data. Also, it is relevant for making predictions, and that was the purpose of this survey, of this study. So a key characteristic of the Delphi, of a Delphi, is a structured questionnaire, and we with iterative procedure. So we devised such a questionnaire with 2 rounds, and after the first round, we anonymized and aggregated feedback and provided that to the experts, who had then a chance of revising their answers and update their opinions, if they wish so, in light of other experts' views. We recruited 12 experts who were experts on migration policies, and they came from various organizations, international organizations, from academia, from think tanks and other policy advisory policy bodies for the policymakers. So what we asked about was the next 10 years perspective, so until about 2030, 2031, on drivers of immigration to the European Union, composition of migration by skill levels, gender and region, and also what will be the priorities of policymakers in terms of migration policies then. So the reason for asking those questions was that we wanted to see what is expected in terms of policies, and based on that and perturbation of the expectations, we could devise narratives and scenarios. So let me move to the first part of the findings. Migration drivers. The experts were asked to vote for various a number of drivers, or provide their own that they feel is relevant. And the key driver found was wage differentials between origin and destination countries, which is perhaps not surprising, and that follows most of the findings in the literature so far. Political stability and conflicts was also highly voted, especially for origin regions in Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also population growth and climate change were voted highly for Africa, for regions in Africa, with climate change not being that prominent. However, it indeed popped up in general, but it did pop up in Africa. Interestingly, economic growth differences or welfare system of the EU or gender equality were not really highly voted. Okay. Let me move to the composition of migration by skill levels. So we asked experts about also what will be the origins and destinations, important origins and important destinations for intra-EU migration first. So let me show you here for the origin of skilled migrants within the EU, as voted by the experts, would be the Eastern EU, followed by the Southern EU, with destinations perhaps unsurprisingly being Western EU, so Germany, France, Benelux, Austria, and Ireland, followed by the Northern EU. In terms of a low-skilled migration, this is slightly different story, because here we have a very high dominance of the Eastern EU. So these are the countries that joined EU in 2000s and later, followed by the Southern EU, to some extent by the Southern EU, and with destinations being even stronger, the Western EU, and then a little more balance between Northern and Southern European Union. In terms of in terms of composition of migration by skill from the rest of the world, here we showing the world regions. This is following United Nations regions, so that's why you see Russia being part of the, in this case, Eastern EU. We found that for the skilled migration, again, experts voted for the non-EU Eastern Europe as well as the Balkans to being the most prominent, most important origin, followed by Asia and to some extent by Africa and North America, where for low-skilled migrants supply, it's a little bit different, because now Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe and the Balkans have equal importance, followed by Asia and North Africa and the Middle East. With destinations, it wasn't that interesting, perhaps, but perhaps as expected, it's almost the entire EU will be the recipient of the skilled migrants, and for low skilled migrants, it's the dominance of Western and Southern European Union. That's what is expected by our experts. Finally, we ask about what policies will be prioritized in the next 10 years. And the policies that were voted highest were actually the restrictive ones, namely the control return policies and also supporting of higher education and highly skilled migration, followed by the intra-EU mobility. And then there's other policies that were kind of in the middle of the importance rankings, were more targeted to specific issues such as shortage, occupation list, or labor market policies driven by labor market demands. Interestingly, the more liberal policies, family-friendly and gender-specific, were voted as at the very bottom of importance and priorities of policymakers in the next 10 years. We also asked about the gender-related issues and gender-related policies. So experts voted for experts predicted that the difference between male and female migration, so as we have seen, for example, from Jan's presentation, there are more male migrants in general. I think it was about 54% or 46%. That's the gender difference, male to female, and that this gap will be decreasing in the next 10 years. And gender balanced policies, despite them being at the very bottom of the priorities as expected by the experts, they will gain more prominence. They will slowly perhaps become more and more important in making those migration policies. The issues that need to be addressed by policymakers in gender-related issues in terms of immigration, migration, and migrant integration is a low labor participation of female immigrants in the labor markets, and also their heavy carrying responsibilities that perhaps stifles the integration, especially economic integration into the labor markets. We also need to remember that about 40%, I think, of migrants or female migrants who are working, they are overqualified for the jobs that they are having, and that's not different in the European Union. Interestingly, the least important issue was occupational gender segregation, such as a low proportion of females in the IT or highly skilled occupations, which perhaps reflects the fact that they are overqualified for the jobs. Few points that also popped up in the qualitative comments from the experts when we asked them to justify or motivate the policies and comment on the whole study in general was that actually it's very difficult to talk about EU-wide policies because all countries have the specific policies and they have this path dependence, so they stem from the past and the situation of their countries, what is the regime and history of migration. That includes also integration policies, and that those countries, it's not only the whole of the EU that is susceptible to shocks, but also specific countries can be susceptible to shocks and specific issues in terms of migration, and these need to be addressed by, for example, different policies, different usage of different policies in specific countries, and also any migration regime changes, such as change from the net sending to net receiving country, can lead to, for example, and politicization, which we have observed in, well, I think it's always been politicized, but last 10 or 20 years has been especially visible, and we know it very well, that leads to policies being made not only based on facts and data, but also on the public opinion and emotions. So that's what should be kept in mind when we talk about future migration policies and future migration trends. We also know that, for example, with shocks, this study was carried out before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we also asked about COVID impact. But I believe that this impact has been really overwhelmed by the aftermath of the war. So thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, please do ask. Feel free to email me, and I would like to just thank all 12 experts who participated in the study, and also colleagues from the FUME and from University of Manchester who made this Delphi possible. Thank you.
Very well, thank you, Arkadiusz. Lots of interesting results here and a good complement, obviously, to the other types of studies with potential migrants, etc. That's been done within the FUME project. You did touch upon many issues. I don't know, and time is running here, but maybe just a final reflection. Did the experts discuss at all how the EU could benefit more from the migration, and that there is also a potential need for more migrants in the future in relation to the aging population, etc.? Were there any discussions about that?
Well, the survey was done in a email form, so there was no actual face-to-face discussion, but you're very right. Actually, experts did point about retaining of human capital, and when we invest in human capital, that we actually do retain them, which is, for example, focusing on intra-EU migration of skilled labor as well, so they don't run away somewhere else, and also attracting those highly skilled migrants from outside of the EU, and then keeping, or for example, keeping those who graduate in the EU, especially in these key sectors. So yes, that was very specific, and I think that was mentioned by several experts. So yes, indeed.
All right, we'll come back to this issue and the issue of circular migration as well, and more legal routes to the EU as well. Right, thanks again, and you'll be back later as well in the program. All right, so for now, before the break, our last of our 4 FUME researchers to present today is Dilek Yildiz. And you have looked more into sort of basically summarizing lots of data that's come up from the previous studies that were presented, and then put these together into a number of potential narratives for the development of the EU, but also of the developing countries. And then as a next phase will be the process of developing the migration scenarios. So Dilek, very welcome to the program.
Thank you, Asa. Let me share my screen.
Yes.
Can you see my screen
Looks
now?
good. Looks good.
Okay, great. So thank you. I will present today the academic perspectives of the scenario steering the international migration. I will also talk briefly about how we combined everything and developed the FUME scenario narratives.
Okay.
So to start with,
sorry, I think you do have it in the wrong mode. Yeah, you should just change to presentation mode. Exactly.
Is
Good.
it better now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So FUME migration scenario narratives, they provide the qualitative reasoning for the FUME scenarios in the quantitative form. And this scenario narratives are built using three groups of information collected in the project. The first one was our report on international migration drivers, and then the Delphi survey Arek mentioned, and also we have an expert survey conducted by our colleagues at Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute, who collected information from migration scholars. So combining these three elements, we developed 6 migration narratives, which summarizes alternative futures in Europe as a receiving country. And we also looked at the less developed regions, which are the sending countries. So we have 2 time periods. The first one is relatively shorter. We looked at between 2020 and 2030. And then a bit more distant period between 2031 and 2050. So for each of these groups, we kind of came up with a story, not story, but the situation, what we expect there based on the results of the surveys. And so we have 2 alternative futures for each of the groupings. One is more positive, the one is more on the challenging side. And we used this information collected from surveys of the experts to fill in the composition of the migrants and build up the future pathways. Let me go back to the academic expert survey now a little bit. Our colleagues Michael Bonoso and Petra De Jong, they were responsible for this expert survey, and they adopted an alternative approach to scenario building than what we are normally used to in migration studies. They borrowed this approach from biodiversity scenarios, and using this approach, they were able to quantify the impact of each driver on migration directly, but also quantify the impact of each driver on other drivers. So combining these two information, then we build up the narratives. To start with, 6 migration drivers were selected. These are demography, society, governance, economy, technology, and global climate change. And for each region, Europe and less developed countries, we have 2 pathways. For example, for Europe and other developed regions, demography features include aging, whereas when we look at other regions, we look at the demographic transition. And it's the global climate change was the same in both. Of course, it was either mitigation or intensification. And then this survey, in the survey, experts were asked about the impacts of the migration drivers on demand for migrants in receiving countries. And these receiving countries are member states of European Union, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and United Kingdom. And pressure to migrate from sending countries. And these sending countries are selected as all the other countries, but except for Canada, United States, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And finally, experts were asked about the impact on drivers on other drivers. As you can see here in the figure, they were asked how each driver will impact other drivers to capture the interaction. So I will briefly present the results. I will just give the key results from this survey. And the survey was done in a Likert scale, like 5-point scale. The values were from strong increase to strong decrease. And then the answers are averaged among respondents. So here we see this. And on the left side of the figure, we look at the impact on demand for migrants in Europe, and demography is a faster aging pathway and economic growth were found to impact the demand for migrants most. And then on the right-hand side, we have the pressure to migrate from less developed regions. Again, demography as in stalled demographic transition and decreased stability in the region and the climate change were found to impact the pressure to migrate the most. And then these experts were asked about the interactions between drivers. So they were asked, do you expect that feature A, as in stalled demographic transition, will lead a feature A or B in this other driver? Here we see an overview of impact of alternative features on drivers. Here rows are presenting the alternative features, and then columns are the impacted drivers. It looks a bit complicated, I'm aware. I will just tell you briefly how it is. And then economic growth, for example, is expected to increase the tolerance toward migrants and mitigate climate change. And here the colors show the decrease in green colors and then increase in orange colors. And the boxes around these features are showing how much the experts agreed among themselves. So the darker the color, the more experts agreed on this result. And similarly, increased tolerance towards migrants was found to expected to result in more economic growth. And this indicates that the experts predicted this causality between these factors in both directions, economic growth impacting more tolerance impacting economic growth, and so on. And on the pressure to migrate side, we found more and more interactions between drivers than on the demand side. But as expected, and also for the similar to the results from the Delphi survey from University in Manchester, they found that increased secularization in less developed countries or sending regions to cause an accelerated demographic transition, economic growth, and mitigation to global warming, whereas the increased conservatism is expected to result in a stalled demographic transition. Additionally, economic growth was expected to result in a faster demographic transition and increased secularization. So we see much more of this connectedness between the drivers. I will not go into detail here, but using these results and interactions between drivers, we came up with alternative features. Here we look at the EU, two alternative features for EU. One is like more on the positive side, like I said, where we have economic growth, which impacts the mitigation, more cooperation between countries, the society is more tolerant, and so on. And on the more challenging side, we have economic stagnation is causing intensification and less cooperation, and also followed by technological slump and slower aging. And when we look at the less developed countries or the sending countries, if we say on the positive side, we have economic growth is related to all positive alternative features in all other drivers. Also with increased stability, they have a strong interaction. Also with accelerated demographic transition and technological boom. And on the more challenging side, we expect a slow demographic transition, more conservative societies, economic stagnation, which is also related a lot with decreased stability. As I said, finally, we combined these stories together and to write the storylines for our narratives. In the 6 narratives, we have quite positive narrative, which we call intensifying global competition, which is very positive, and then ranging to longer economic slowdown in all regions. Here it's the 4th one, for example. And then we try to account as many possibilities as possible here in the narratives. But the quantification of these narratives are done of course, in our migration projection model and population projection model, along with the assumptions. And yeah, I think I will stop here, and if there are questions, we can go more in detail.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dilek. I think, time is running, obviously, but maybe you could just say a few words if or which of these narratives would you and the researchers believe is the most probable ones, or have you looked at it from that perspective as well, or are all of these as likely?
Thank you for the question. Because when we started with the surveys have been conducted before the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and then we finished the narratives around that time. So at that point, we were thinking about the recovery in the EU as in the recovery from COVID's economic stallment. But now, because of the situation, we felt like this is less likely. Therefore, with our colleagues at YASA and NIDI, especially who are responsible for national projections and the regional projections, we decided to change this scenario a little bit and consider a more negative, more challenging situation also between 2020 to 30. So this is our main scenario, and then our other narratives are deviating from there.
Okay, so we could see this list as a little bit also of like the top most probable scenarios are at the top here of this list. And we're hoping, we're not looking for disaster at this stage, although of course a lot of uncertainties here. Are there any of these drivers that you would like to highlight as more surprising than others, or aspects that are often overlooked in migration research, would you say?
Yeah, but I should say there were not really real surprises especially in the academic expert survey, as we expected. The most important drivers on the demand of migrants in EU, they came up as aging and economical growth. And on the other side, the pressure to migrate from other regions, they were stalled demographic transition and less stability and economical stallment, but also climate change was expected to play a big role here. As Arek mentioned before, this climate change was more related to the pressure to migrate from these regions than on the demand on migrants in the EU side.
And that, I guess, is also going to be a bit of a contradiction or a bit of a conflicting thing moving forward, that continued growth can also harm the climate. So it's about creating growth that works within the limits of climate and the earth. So very interesting. Thanks again, Dilek. And you'll also come back in the discussion a little bit later. So I think for now, all of us feel very that we have now received lots of interesting information, and we might need to digest that over a cup of coffee for the coming 5 minutes. So we'll have a 5 minutes intermission here, and then we'll be back with the program 5 minutes from now. So that will be not 10:45, but maybe 10:47. So see you all in a little bit, and stay tuned for part 2, where we will look for further into policy recommendations and implications from these different findings. Thank you. Great, so we're back. I hope all of you got a cup of coffee or something similar to cheer you up. Anyways, going back to the program, we had a first part of the program hearing from 4 of our FUME researchers about different drivers for migration to Europe and the different scenarios that we can make out of that data. And now I've Tim Heleniak with me here. You're one of the senior researchers here at Norregio and part of the FUME project as well. And we also have one of your colleagues, Nora, on screen with us today. She unfortunately couldn't be in the studio with us today. And you have started working on the policy recommendations and implications of all this data and findings. So yeah, I'll give the word to you, and we'll see what you have how you have summarized all this information, and then we'll come back with the discussion and comments on these recommendations. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, as Osa said, my name is Timothy Heleniak. I'm a senior research fellow here at Norregio, and along with my colleague Nora Sanchez-Goshen, we have poured through the reports. You've heard summaries of these reports in the previous hour. and tried to pull out some of the policy recommendations, some of the key findings. And as was mentioned, I believe at the outset, these are very much preliminary policy recommendations. So we rely on you as the kind of migration experts to comment on these and to give us any suggestions or any feedback, either in the chat or in the discussion later or after the webinar. So one of the key findings or recommendations, and this was pointed out earlier in the scenarios, is that Europe will remain an attractive destination for migrants in the coming decades. All 6 of the migration scenarios assume a continued migration pressure in the developing countries into Europe. And in all of the narratives, Europe will remain one of the preferred destination regions of migrants. There's others in the world, certainly the United States, South Asia, but Europe will certainly remain one of the preferred destination regions. So this is something for policymakers to keep in mind. And I guess this was also pointed out, is that the need for immigrant labor will likely increase in the coming decades. There's the issue of population aging, which has been underway for quite a number of decades, differently between the different countries. There's a decline in the working age population, and so the demand for immigrant labor will likely increase. Part of this could this decline in the labor force could be met by increasing labor force participation rates among older people, but nobody wants to work until age 90, so people do want to retire. We could increase labor force participation rates among women as well, and also among the migrant populations already present in Europe, but certainly not all of this can be met. So some amount of migrant labor will become necessary. But one of the findings we've had is that migration policies cannot completely control the migration flows as much as they wanted to. I think this was also pointed out. There's been a rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric over the past decades, and a rise in anti-immigrant parties. And I highlight in the picture here the new center-right government that was voted in here in Sweden in September of this year, very much on an anti-immigrant platform. I don't know if you recall back to the quote-unquote migration crisis in 2015, 2016. Sweden was one of the countries that received per capita the largest number of immigrants. And the takeaway point here is that even with restrictive migration policies, and that's what this new Swedish government is trying to do, they cannot completely control all migration flows. There's a lot of exogenous factors and that impact migration. This was pointed out in some of the previous talks. So one of the aspects or policies that could be implemented is to harness the opportunities of circular migration. Policymakers should plan for these migration flows that are expected and develop policies that are beneficial for all sides, for the receiving countries, for the sending countries, and the migrants themselves. And instead of trying to just stop migration completely, make or develop a system or develop policies where people can kind of come and go. And then there's also, like I said, this acknowledgement of the beneficial role of circular migration in both sending and receiving countries, which could be developed. Another aspect to take into consideration is the opportunities offered by remote work. I'm sitting here in Stockholm. We have colleagues in, 4 or 5 different countries. Prior to this pandemic, we might have done this webinar sitting all in the same room. But with the development of these digital tools, we have the opportunity to do this remotely. If you look at a lot of job announcements today, they oftentimes have the qualifier. This position is either on site or hybrid or remote. And this, we've all come up with different ways of working over the last 2 or 3 years. combining work at home and second homes. And this can certainly be applied to migration. I mean, especially with highly skilled jobs. I mean, a lot of these can be done when we say second homes, that could be your country of destination. So this is something that's not really been talked about in the context of migration, but it's certainly something that could be talked about. And another aspect that was highlighted earlier was the need to take into account gender aspects when developing migration and integration policies. About half of the world's migrants are women. It varies a bit by migration stream, but it's no longer, migration is not something that just men do. I mean, there's certainly a lot of women. We show this picture of female workers at fish processing plants in northwest Iceland. This is from a case study we did at Nordregio a few years ago. And it was also pointed out earlier in I believe in the expert studies, that a lot of the migration integration policies do not explicitly consider the gender aspects and the differential impacts that migration has or migration policies have on men and women. So that's certainly something that could or should be taken into consideration. And next is the harnessing the opportunities for immigration of rural and remote areas. A lot of rural and remote areas in Europe are suffering from outmigration, depopulation, the decline in their economies, decline in services. And this map is from of the Nordic region, from a study that we did several years ago, and it shows three different types of regions. Those regions in green are regions where the population is increasing. It would have increased even with international migration. Those regions in red are those regions that had positive international migration, but declined in population size regardless. The more interesting regions are those in yellow, and this is where, at least in the Nordic region, the population increased in size over this period only because there was international migration. So if you zoom in on the smaller map showing at the regional level for Sweden and Norway, I mean, most of the regions outside of the capitals, the population would have declined if there hadn't been international migration. So at least on a quantitative level, international migration can be a bonus to some of these rural and remote regions. They can revive certainly the economies of these places. A lot of these places have aging populations, and certainly in terms of service delivery. And we at Nordregio certainly found examples of this. So if international migrants can be encouraged to move, stay in some of these areas, they can certainly counteract some of the effects of depopulation and revive a lot of these declining areas. And this was talked about again in some of the case studies earlier. There's a lot of development opportunities. The income gap between Europe and some of the countries of origin is one of the main drivers of migration. Young people especially leave, or at least try to leave, or have the aspiration to leave their home countries because there's a lack of opportunity in them. So narrowing this economic the gap in economic growth between Europe and some of these developing countries is one of the best ways to reduce immigration to the continent. Many young people want to actually stay in their home countries. They only want to leave because there are a lack of opportunities in some of their home countries. And I'll conclude there and say that, like I said earlier, repeat myself, a lot of these suggestions or these recommendations are preliminary, so we more than welcome your comments or suggestions as migration experts or people interested in migration.
Thank you so much, Tim. And yes, let's get started to hear some comments, and also thank you, dear audience, for posting lots of relevant questions. So we'll come back to those very soon. Before we turn to the questions in the chat, I would just like to invite two more of our speakers here on the program. And As was mentioned by Carsten initially, the FUME project has actually two sister projects also looking at migration scenarios and policies in Europe the coming years. And one of those projects is called Hummingbird. And we have with us today Sinem Yilmaz, who is a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Group. So we asked you today to comment a little bit on these policy recommendations or conclusions that we've been drawing so far from the FUME results. And also, of course, you're welcome to say a few words about your project at this point. So Sinem, very welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I am representing here, first of all, Migration Policy Group, which is a think and do tank in Brussels, working on migration, integration, and anti-discrimination policies, and also Hummingbird, as you already mentioned, which is also working on creating some scenarios, but we have not still developed the scenarios. It will be also very helpful for us to see the different scenarios that you created. So one, there might be so many comments that could also be helpful from Hummingbird perspective, but one thing that really that can be very important is to talk about the how policies could be really prepared for this scenario. So it could be one of the recommendations and what they should do in the first place. So maybe one small recommendation for policymakers is to be prepared with a systematic data collection, because now we still have problems with the current official statistics that we have, especially if we look at, for example, Eurostat. If we look at these migration reasons, there we see a couple of categories. So they are super broad and they do not really include all the things that we mentioned in your drivers, which will be very important in the coming years. If we look at the scenarios, for example, environmental changes or societal expectations, they are usually under other category in Eurostat, in migration drivers, but we believe that this is very important to look into on time, to be prepared to prepare evidence-based policies for these new changes. And also another thing is gender. We looked at gender in one of our recent papers on Hummingbird. We see that the data doesn't even have basic sex disaggregated differentiation. In many cases, when it comes to migration, we cannot see the real impact of gender on migration drivers and reasons. It is also one of the aspects that you already discovered in your findings. This might be one of the basic comments, and one maybe contribution from Hummingbird, because MPG, Migration Policy Group, we work on migration policies. There are different partners working on social media, environmental data, but our expertise is on migration policies. And what we saw with the data that has been collected in quantitative and qualitative ways for Hummingbird, we should make a differentiation between border management and migration governance. When we talk about migration policies, we kind of have this flexibility because migration policy is not really defined at all. So everyone can use it in different ways because we don't have a clear-cut definition of migration policy. We can include border management, or we can say, yeah, maybe we should not include. It really depends on our perspective. But our perspective is to really put this migration policy from a humanitarian perspective. So how we can handle this whole process of migration in a more humanitarian way possible. So by looking at the governance governance level of migration policies. So maybe in your recommendation, you can also refer to this humanitarian perspective, not only talking about how migration policies can be restrictive, but they cannot still restrict migration because there are unintended effects. There will be more irregular migration when you restrict it. This is all clear cut in the research as well, but we need to also put something on the humanitarian aspect. We really don't need to stress out the restrictive aspect of policies, but what can be done to make it more humanitarian. As a first comment, these maybe that will be enough, I think.
And we can come back to this latter comment as well, maybe also in relation to the concept of circular migration and more legal routes into Europe, and how to create a system where both European countries and sending countries can benefit, and people, of course, can benefit more from migration. Thank you so much for that, Sinem, to start with, and hang in there or stay with us as we also hear from another colleague in the FUME family here, from also on the FUME advisory board, Sabina Kubiciel-Lodzinska. You have more of a Polish local and regional perspective on migration, and you've been part of the project in different ways. So we asked you to also comment on these findings so far. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Warm greetings from Opole. As you said, I'm a researcher. I'm working at Opole University of Technology, and since I think 15 years, I'm dealing with migration. My latest study focused on the migration of highly skilled Ukrainians in Poland. I'm also part of a team working on policy recommendations for refugees in Opolskie Voivodeship. And I'm also a part of a team which examines the attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees in Poland. We ask them, our inhabitants, for example, about their fears and hopes related to the influx of refugees. Before I start, I would also introduce a little bit the Opolskie Voivodeship, because I think in the case of migration, it could be interesting. Opolskie is a unique region in Poland because people of Polish and German origin live here, and that's why we were able to work without any additional documents even before joining the European Union, for example, in Germany and in the Netherlands. That's why we are a region with the biggest decline, and in our case, migrations are a great opportunity, a great chance for the population. I have also personal experience in that case because my family is such an example. We are not only of Polish origin, but also of German origin. That's why my father, for over 20 years, lived between Opole and Germany, where he worked most of the year. Also, a large part of my family decided to immigrate to Germany, not only temporary, but they stayed there and lived there. So migration is not only a topic of my professional involvement, but also a part of my personal experience. That's why I'm really happy to be part of your team. And about the recommendation, I was also thinking about the systematic collection of data, because in Poland we have a huge problem with that. Jan Brzozowski mentioned it already, that it's not so easy to run research on migrants in Poland, because it's not so easy to know how many people we have. We have, of course, work permits and other additional documents which show us how many people are working in Poland, but these are documents, not people. That's why it's very important when we are thinking about future scenarios of migration. And because I'm now dealing with a project which is connected with skills of migrants, especially about skills of Ukrainian migrants, I was also thinking about collection of more detailed data. For example, we know how many people, for example, are in a country, but it would be also very useful to know what skills they have. For example, now in Poland, we know from our research, for example, from the research that we have did in Opolskie Voivodeship, that over 40% of refugees are highly skilled. Even other research done on the Poland's level shows that it could be over 70% of refugees with university degree. Well, to welcome such high qualified residents, it's a gift, but of course, if we can make use of their qualification. Also, the case of women was here mentioned. Jan said that the influx of economic migrants to Poland was mainly focused on males, but now it's changed. I looked for last statistics, which shows that now more Ukrainian women work in Poland than Ukrainian men. The share of women among Ukrainians employed in Poland in November last year increased to almost 64%, and compared to a year ago, I mean 2021, the share of women was about 45%. So it is different now in our country. And of course, when we think about the influx of women, especially in the case of refugees, they differ from the economics because they came with children. The economics migrants usually came alone, and their families stayed at home, like in my case. Yes, my father went abroad to earn money, but we stayed in Opole. So
yeah.
But
that's also what Jan mentioned,
yes,
that's been a shift since the war started, that also some family members from Ukraine have come to Poland to reside in Poland rather than Ukrainian men going back to the Ukraine. So I understand that has also changed the composition of the refugee group. I don't know, before we open the floor to look at the questions in the chat, just if you could comment just briefly also on you mentioned the attitudes, that you had also surveyed the attitudes among Polish people in relation to the increased immigration and of Ukrainians. Could you say anything about that? How are the sentiments, and has it changed over time the past year?
We had around 4 rounds of this survey. The first one, when the war was broken, it's English word, when it starts. So it was on the 24th of February. We did it on a research panel where the respondents are registered, so it is quite easy to get the response. And when the war starts, almost 70% of Poles told that they had positive attitudes towards the refugees. Then in March, it was even more, about 80%. And in the survey that we have done in November, I think this last year, the openness rate, let's say, it was a little bit deeper.
Lower?
It was
higher
lower,
or
yes,
lower?
lower. It was about 70%, but it is still very, very
still high.
Positive. Yes,
Yeah.
it's very high. So still, our openness to refugees, to Ukraine is very, very good. But I know maybe it's also important that you have to know that in Poland we have two attitudes of our current government towards migrants and refugees. Positive, it is connected with Ukrainians, but we have also negative attitudes towards people from cultural and religious distant countries. I'm talking about our border with
Belarus.
Yes, thank you, with Belarus, where people are dying, and we have their problems.
So that attitude hasn't necessarily changed with the war in Ukraine, but the attitudes towards Ukrainians is still strongly positive. I think that's very interesting to hear. To dig a little deeper and look more into the Polish situation. So stay with us, and then I think I'll just welcome Vaida over here as well, and we'll look into the chat and see what's in there. And then we also have Tim still with us here in the room to also answer questions, but also, of course, our other previous speakers here on the program. So Vaida, what did you find there?
Right, there's a lot of both academic and policy-oriented discussions going on in Q&A, and we will bring them up to also give a bit of a more room for different perspectives. So first, actually, it is a question to Tim and Nora. Since you have presented, maybe Tim, you could join us in the studio, and Nora as well online, be highlighted. So how do you define actually circular migration, and how to make it happen? What are your reflections? So maybe first the definition itself.
I don't know, who wants to start?
Nora has, and
Do you want to start?
Yes, we haven't gone so far as defining circular migration directly yet, but what is meant is, of course, migration that has sort of a clearly predefined start and end date, where migrants are given the opportunity to come to Europe, for example, as seasonal workers for temporary stays. Then we have to discuss how long you should define that. But for temporarily clearly defined phases to work before they go back to their country of origin. And of course, the circularity comes in when you give repeated opportunities to migrate, or not to migrate, but to come to Europe to work. Part of the idea is, of course, that responds a little bit to migration pressures. But it would take away this pressure to come to Europe more permanently, perhaps on illegal basis through these very dangerous different channels. So it would, in a way, pick up this kind of interest of potential migrants to earn better wages, to have more opportunities without necessarily uprooting them at home. And we've heard, we didn't go into very much detail here, but in the case study countries, we heard from potential migrants that were interviewed there that indeed circular migration could be an opportunity for them that would be interesting and relevant and respond to some of these interests they have. But indeed, exactly how to define it, this is something we still need to reflect more on and see if we can bring that into the policy recommendations.
I think this could also be an issue where some of the other speakers today might have comments. I don't know, Sinem, if you wanted to say something more about this topic as well from your policy perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems a good opportunity for sure because it is legal. So when we talk about these illegal routes and the unsafe routes for migrants, circular migration could be an opportunity. But I will also be cautious to really just to promote it as something, because then the policymakers certainly can take it as an opportunity to find a solution for long-term migration-related problems, because it's we need to really check who is really benefiting from that. There are also studies showing that it's a really last resort for people who would like to migrate because they cannot find legal routes to migrate. So circular migration can be something. They can be seasonal migrants, especially lower educated migrants. But this is only when they cannot have any other option. So it's a way of survival for them. And when we look at the wages of these people, they do not really, they only earn moderate amounts from this like seasonal works or circular migration. So it is not also something that they can prefer if they have any other option. So if we look at the sending countries, there is not enough proof to show that they really earn something from it in terms of economical resources. But who earns from that? Of course, destination countries, because they satisfy their specific labor market needs and they don't need to invest anything in the integration of these people. And from the perspective of migrants, they don't really learn anything from this experience in terms of skills, because there is no training. They don't even learn the language. So it's just go there, satisfy the needs and get something and go back. And we also should not really forget about this sociological perspective of this from migrants' point of view, because they there are so many personal hardships in that. So like being a circular migrant, so just going there for a few months and then coming back to your country, which is probably an underdeveloped country or just a developing country, you still have economic hardships there. And there will be family separation, repeated absence, and there will be issues about emotional well-being as well. So it could be something in the recommendations for sure, because it's a legal way. But we should also not forget all these drawbacks, and also like you cannot really control overstaying with the circular migration. This is also something for destination countries.
And then it will also not help destination countries with the declining, or not declining, but aging population, etc. It's not a long-term solution in any of the countries involved, for sure. Very interesting comments. Yes, Sabina, you also had a comment to this.
Yes, I would add also some words to this, because yes, in Oposke we have a very great experience in circular migration. And as Tina mentioned, it has, of course, many bad sides. I know it, yes, because this is
from your personal experience.
Yes, my personal experience.
Yeah.
But also from the perspective of my region, when we think about policy recommendation, I would say that, for example, in Opole, it was a very lack of support for people who return from migration, for example, to set up their own businesses. We didn't thought about it. They went to work, they bought money, but it was not invested in something that would bring income in the future. Of course, from the money, houses were renovated, cars were bought, but there was nothing for the future. And also this didn't help the economy of our region. So when we think about the recommendations, especially for the country of origin, I would add also thinking about a strategy, how to use, for example, the incomes, how to support starting businesses of the remigrants.
Right. And actually, you pointed out two very important things in this discussion that also have emerged in the Q&A session. It's about the EU strategy, migration strategy, how to actually long-term strategy to fill in the migration gap, or, for example, to solve the problems like aging population or care for aging population, or, for example, if we want more people working with a transport in the transport sector or construction sector, how do we actually, is the circular migration solution is actually viable for long term? How do we know that people would return? Like, what are your reflections? Maybe Timothy, you have any?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And mentioned earlier the unintended consequences of migration or migration policies. And there certainly are a lot of these. I mean, policymakers in the capital cities can make migration policy, but oftentimes those don't think through all the consequences of those. And yeah, I mean, you're right. The issue of overstaying visas and not being able to leave when migrants are so opposed to. So it is difficult, but in a sense, what I think maybe Nora can comment on this, we haven't thought through all the issues around circular migration, but part of it is, I mean, permanent migration and circular migration are linked in a certain way, in that and I know this from a lot of examples in Sweden. People are given if they're not given some permanent migration status, they tend to want to leave, and so and they can't leave until they get permanent residency. So if they have a permanent residency, then they can kind of go and come as they please.
So I think, and this also will be very, we then need to set very high requirements also, I think, on employers employing migrants in this way. So to ensure to try and reduce these potential negative effects when people are also become very dependent on certain employers that provide the visas, and that's also something that's definitely on the policy agenda here in Sweden and other Nordic countries as well. Any further comments on this topic before we go to the next question here? Doesn't look like it. So Vaida, what's more in here?
Perhaps as an additional aspect that has emerged already as well in this discussion, it's about the cultural integration and the civic society creation when we have a circular economy and the effects of that. So have you considered, Nora and Tim, also this aspect in the policy recommendations?
No, I think the question of cultural integration is, of course, a really relevant one, not simply in relation to circular migrants, but also more broadly, how we can become better at that. Because I think one of the striking things we find is that for immigrants, the motivation to work, earn a better salary is so high. It's one of the leading motivations or drivers of migration. At the same time, we know, for example, in the Nordic countries, that immigrants are one of the most vulnerable group on the labor market, with high unemployment rates, often getting stuck in long-term unemployment, in really vulnerable positions. So we clearly, I think, talking about future migration is one issue, but talking about how we can become better, actually using the potentials of migrants that are already in Europe, is at least as important, especially if we want to then build on that going further in the future. Just one word I wanted to add on the cultural migration. We focus very much on that, but I want to stress that we would not sort of promote this as the solution for the future, but just as one of the many tools that are sort of in the box. We also, of course, have to stress that circular migration could, from a European perspective, perhaps be one tool to help address some of the labor shortages that are emerging in our aging societies, but it certainly won't work for all sectors and for lots of different tasks. So this is also, of course, something that has to be considered when and in which contexts could that actually be a solution. And then, of course, we need the framework to make sure that this is not will be done for the benefit of all groups, not just those European employers. Maybe I'll end there with those comments.
Thank you, Nora. Do you have anything more now, or should we? Yes.
So we have actually quite a few interesting reflections, and perhaps here I would like to call Karsten or Dilek to comment, or also Nora or Tim, because it is a question about the migration flows within the EU, and when it comes to the migration within the EU, it's not always considered as the migration because it's connected to the freedom of movement, but it also has significant economic, social, and political consequences. In the migration studies, how do you address this area, like the migration within the EU, and how does it affect the projections and thinking about the possible scenarios? Maybe Dilek, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Ida. We do account for the intra-EU migration. I mean, normally we hear it as a mobility, but in our especially quantitative migration projections and population projections, we do have country-to-country migration within EU member states. So this is not an aspect we are just overlooking. And we know that it has consequences, and so. And also in our presentation in the Delphi survey, there were questions asking about the characteristics of migrants in this region as well. So, yeah.
So this aspect will be also reflected once the modeling part is finalized, and we'll actually get the future projections. Is that correct, Dilek?
Exactly, we will have them.
Yes, and when it comes also to statistics, we have been discussing about like different challenges that comes emerges from the statistical collection. Perhaps maybe Timothy, you also have been experiencing this. How to basically see the motivation of migrants, and is it well reflected in the statistics, and then can it be verified, or can it be considered as a valid response sometimes when people are responding to these surveys on why are they migrating, and how to basically evaluate that statistically?
Yeah, no, good question. Oftentimes we don't get, migrants aren't asked why they migrate. And so we kind of have to infer from their age and what they're doing in the country it was pointed out earlier that even gender disaggregated migration data is lacking. And I mean, I've been dealing with migration data for, I guess, much of my career. And I mean, it's very different from data on births and deaths. You're born once, you die once, but you migrate many, many times. And oftentimes the problem is that countries of origin have much better data on than countries of destination have much better data than countries of origin. And I think it was brought up earlier, there's a difference between a migration event and a migration person. And so there are difficulties. And so, yeah, we do the best we can in this project and use the data that's available in our modeling. And we qualify that and document what exactly we're measuring. So.
And I guess part of the FUME, the innovation within the FUME project has also been the different methods used in the sending countries in terms of capturing these different, different drivers and getting more in depth into what's happening in these specific cities, and also landing in the fact that most people actually don't leave the cities. Where many people do leave from, but it's also a substantial part of the people who migrate to these cities that actually never leave and become international migrants. So I think that's another thing that you have brought up here within the FUME project as well. I think in relation to data and verifying things, I think that another aspect that hasn't been talked about so much today is the role of social media. As a news channel, and that there are definitely, it's probably a mixed blessing, right? And I would like to hear from some of the researchers here if you have your thoughts on the role of social media moving forward in terms of the possibility for refugees to make more informed decisions based on news shared on social media, but also the risk of more fake news and other things being shared and spread via social media. Anyone wants to comment on the role of social media here? No one wants to comment on that. Nora, I think you have some thoughts at least.
Yeah, we just see from the FUME project, but also from other projects where we've been doing, especially now in the Ukraine crisis, how social media are really important for migrants before they move, while they move, and when they arrive, to sort of get key essential information to help them in this process. We've also seen that there's a risk, at least, that there might be misinformation flowing around. So one of the things we think are important to highlight, and that's also something we heard from different organizations, that organizations in receiving countries, especially who are dealing with newcomers, who are the first sort of points of information and support, that they need to be very active on social media, especially when it's possible in the native language of those people who are coming, to really establish good presences there. And this is in the process, but to really be a source of reliable information that people who are searching for information can turn to. We see that sometimes it takes a while. For example, now with the Ukraine crisis, that it took a little while for different authorities to get the information there, also in the right languages. But we see that it's really important to be on the right platforms and to provide relevant information there. That this is often the easiest way to have a first connection to the people who are coming.
Sabina or Jan, I don't know if any of you wanted to comment in relation to the Ukrainian refugees in Poland, how social media has been used by authorities in Poland to help with information flow and directing people in a more efficient way. Jan?
Well, yes, thank you for this question. It's I mean, a very broad topic, but I already mentioned that in Poland, a handicap was that before the war, there was a very large community of Ukrainians already well settled in the country. We are talking about 1.3 million people. and their social media networks were very well established. So Polish authorities, although of course the magnitude of refugee flow was tremendous, and it was really difficult to manage in the first days, months of the war, could simply go in partnership with Ukrainian NGOs who played the role of advocates. So the already established diaspora organizations, and some of them formal, some other informal, immediately engaged themselves. So they offered also assistance in terms of translating some messages, some most important communications. So it worked very efficiently. And of course, the biggest praise is to be given to the tertiary sector, not to government, but the government at least was able to exploit on this. Yes, so from the very beginning, the social media, I'm not only talking about Facebook. Actually, Facebook is not so much pronounced among Ukrainians, but rather Viber, Telegram was full of messages which were really reliable, because these were messages conveyed from the Polish government, Polish authorities, how to find assistance while crossing the border, just after the crossing the border, depending whether you were crossing it on foot, with train, with the buses, what to do next, what you could expect, and so on. So this was extremely helpful, but we were in a very, I would say, we were very lucky that the Ukrainian diaspora was already quite active in social media before.
Super interesting. Carolina, maybe you could comment in your different interviews in the different sending countries. Did this come up as an important aspect as well in any of the countries in particular?
Of course, social media came out as a aspect. However, I think what should be underlined, it's not only open groups or social media that we can easily observe as researchers. Most of the information are given through closed group, which are extremely difficult to investigate, mostly because of ethical reasons. Because like you cannot openly say that you're a researcher, or you are, because then they will not let you in, or you are just collecting data in an ethical way. But what we need also to remember that no matter what kind of information are given in social media, there is always this psychological belief that no matter that 100 people drawn in a sea or failed crossing the border and so on, but there is this one who managed, and there is this so huge belief that I'm going to be this one who managed, that will be the one who will make it. This or that way, it's crucial to give those opportunities for legal and manageable way to cross the border in order to manage. It's more about manage migration, not about closing borders. And also through social media, such approach should be promoted to potential migrants. Otherwise, C is available for everyone.
Thank you so much. Very, very relevant points here to discuss. Any other questions from the chat?
I think we covered most of the main questions that have been brought up by the discussion.
Yeah,
participants.
I think one other thing, as I mean, in this time and age of war and migration, the overall lingering big issue and threat to us all is, of course, climate change, and that as a trigger for migration as well. It's been mentioned a little bit, but do you think that there's also a need for even better or combining climate modeling and migration modeling here to try and figure out even more which areas in the world are most at risk of climate change negative effects, which could then spur or promote more migration. I don't know if anyone wanted to comment on this aspect as well before we finish. Yes, Carolina.
Yeah, I can take it on. We had very interesting panel session in June in Austria.
Sorry,
in June in Vienna.
Yeah.
In YASA, it was YASA conference. It was about modeling migration, and also related with not only climate change, but even more like environmental change. I prefer to look at the
yeah, of course, climate could be like the umbrella, but of course there are many other threats.
I would say otherwise, environment is an umbrella where climate is just one. And like just one point I would like to mention here, it was one of conclusions from that session, that modeling relies on data that are available, because it's something you need. In order to model, you need something what you can count, what is quantifiable, and what you gather data for a longer time. And qualitative research gives really interesting input about other factors that are not measured in a quantified way. And it's very important to merge both, like to try to collect more data that will show more variety among even small cases, because it's easy to model the influence of sea level rise on migration. But if you do not look at, or you are not able to include the scale of infiltration of salty water into the soil in the terrain, which won't be covered by the sea level rise, and it's that those data about migration are not relevant or do not show the real scale of the future challenge. And intentionally, I use the word challenge instead of problem, because it's something that we need to manage and find a solution. And we can look for this. And also, like further, if we look at recommendations, policy recommendations, all those aspects cannot rely only. I know that policymakers love data, and it's so easy to justify our decision by data, which are quantified and so on. Each action should be foreseen or proceed by deep analysis of consequences of each step. There was this discussion also in chat about circular migration. Even circular migration, as it was mentioned, has its negative effects. And they are, okay, we can look at this positively in a frame of receiving countries, but consequences are not only for receiving countries, they are also for origin countries. And they are not only economic, they're also cultural, and should be perceived on both like national, regional, and very micro level. So we have those different factors, because migration decision is never decision, it is decision of single person in the end. But it's framed in an environment, in a very small environment of a household, in a little bit larger environment of surrounding, like village, city, big family, but also national and even international level. Most of migrants who make like decision, as what was the result of our research, decision is not the one and stable in a lifetime. It's not that I am making decision my home that, okay, I'm reaching Europe. It usually is never this way. Decision on movement, on steps, is made step by step from one place to the other. And without,
you have to reconsider and rethink,
yes,
and see what the opportunities are and how they're changing.
And in space,
yeah,
as well. So, and we need both data to be merged and to work together in order to make good prognosis, good models, and to create policy that will give safety for both receiving society as well for those who would like to move or who stay behind. Because talking about migration, we cannot only talk about those who move, but also about those who are left behind, or who are somewhere stuck, or who are just immobile and will stay.
And how they can benefit also from them maybe having family members who have work somewhere else. But also that's another huge debate, of course, on how Europe can help or support the development of these sending countries and cities. I mean, that's obviously a big part of this as well. If we want to work on this migration in a different way, it's also about creating more opportunities in these places in terms of work and economic opportunities as well. And that's probably a topic for another seminar and not today. But thank you so much, Carolina, for elaborating further, and remind ourselves always that this is a matter of individuals making difficult choices in their lives, and how to address those in the best possible way for everyone involved. So I think at this stage, let's just go back to Carsten for just a brief final comment to wrap up this session and webinar for today. So Carsten, what would be your main takeaways maybe from today, and what are the next steps in the FUME project?
Thank you very much to everyone. Very interesting discussion and useful contributions. I think one thing that we've seen in this final discussion is that FUME is by no means able to cover all aspects of migration. I mean, it's a super complex topic. The issue of integration came up, which role migrants play in the society that they move into. Of course, we have certain things in mind that we would like work migrants to do in Europe, but whether they actually do them once they arrive is a different question. So there are many things that we cannot take into account here. So, and I think this is important to keep in mind when it comes to the policy recommendations, that we can only make recommendations based on the things that we have actually investigated in detail in the project, that we can say we have these different possible futures that seem plausible based on the current situation and based on historic data, because most of what we do is based on historic data. We can expect the following developments. So I think it's important to always also point out that, of course, we cannot predict the future. We can only point out where things can go and
definitely. But the next step in practical terms for your FUME project is finalizing this policy brief we have discussed today, and then you'll continue also finalizing the different scenarios, right? You're still in the phase of doing that. And as I understand it, there will be yet another policy brief summarizing a few other aspects. And then you'll wrap it up together, all of you, and hopefully many of you who listened in today as well and contributed with questions, when it's time for the final conference, which will happen both physically in Brussels and probably also with the possibility to participate online, right?
That's the plan at the moment, yes. We're currently figuring out where exactly and when exactly it will be.
So we'll come back. Yes, exactly. Stay tuned. We'll come back with more information, and all of you who followed today, and for all of you who signed up but couldn't be with us today, we'll provide more information on email beginning of next week with the recording of the webinar and discussion, and also the presentations that were presented here today, and some of the links and things that you added in the chat. So once again, thank you so much for joining us this Friday morning for this FUME webinar, and we will keep in touch. And thanks again for your engagement in this super important issue. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.